Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Alexander Piñeres, and I serve as Director of Programs here at Levine Museum of the New South. Tonight, we welcome you alongside the Museum of the Southeast American Indian for Allies or Colonized, a conversation with Dr. Alan Gallay. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors who make our Southern Accents programs a possibility. The Infusion Fund, a partnership between the City of Charlotte and Foundation for the Carolinas, and Merge Heart and Soul. If you wish to support the museum in its effort to provide engaging programming, please follow the link in the comment sections. Likewise, please give us your feedback on tonight's programs. We would love to hear your suggestions also on future programming. The survey link is on the comment sections as well. We also want to invite you all to use the chat function to engage with us, with each other, and also to ask questions for our panelists this evening. Now I'll pass it on to our moderator, our good friend Nancy Strickland Fields. Nancy serves as director and curator of the Museum of the Southeast American Indian in Pembroke, North Carolina. Her career in museum has focused on education and administration, and she has worked at the Museum of Contemporary Native Art in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., and the American Indian Cultural Center and Museum in Oklahoma City. She is the first Lumby graduate of the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where she earned a bachelor's degree in museum studies. Nancy earned her master's degree in history from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington and is currently a doctoral student in the public history program at North Carolina State University. Nancy, thank you for always partnering with Levine Museum, and I'll pass it on to you now. I hope you all enjoyed tonight's program.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for partnering with the museum on this project. You guys have been absolutely wonderful, and it's great to work with you again, especially on a topic that really helps situate Native peoples in the context of the South, and especially with the mission of your museum in the New South. So thank you, and thank you to the Levine for being such a wonderful partner. And this evening, as part of your Southern Accent series, we have a very special guest. I am honored to introduce Dr. Alan Gallay. I first became acquainted with Dr. Gallay's scholarship while I was a graduate student at UNCW. I read his highly acclaimed book, The Indian Slave Trade, The Rise of the English Empire in the American South from 1670 to 1717. And I have to say, as a Native person from North Carolina, this book afforded me the missing links to much of our history and explained the legacies of Native slavery that many of us still live with today. Moving forward has also informed my own scholarship and research, and I'm forever grateful for that book and the scholarship that Dr. Goulet has produced. This opportunity actually has come about in partnership with the Ackland Museum, the Ackland Art Museum at UNC Chapel Hill. We have on exhibit right now, Intersection of Worlds, the Theodor de Bry engravings. This exhibit features the original 430-year-old, I think they're about 432-year-old, original de Bry engravings, which were inspired by John White's watercolors that he produced while he was at Fort Raleigh I think it's 1586 to 1587, and who he returned back to London and shared these with Sir Walter Raleigh, who actually funded the colony. Dr. Goulet has written a book, which I have right here, called Architect of an Empire, Walter Raleigh. And tonight we are going to unpack some of the themes of the book and explore a very different history than many of us are familiar with, especially it relates to Native peoples and colonization. Now, real quickly, I'm going to read through Dr. Gallay's bio, and then we will get started with our program. Dr. Alan Gallay is a historian of early America and the Atlantic world with special interest in Native peoples. He has published 7 books, including the Bancroft Prize-winning The Indian Slave Trade, The Rise of the English Empire in the American South, 1670 to 1770. That was published by Yale. The edited collection, Indian Slavery in Colonial America, published by Nebraska Press in 2009. And most recently, Walter Raleigh, Architect of an Empire, by Basic in 2019. The last book traces the earliest development of English ideas about America's native peoples in the 16th century to their origins in English colonizing experiences in medieval Ireland. These ideas stood in opposition to the mystical Christian philosophy of Hermeticism, which offered an alternative view wherein it was believed that America's native people were especially blessed by God and held secrets of the universe that they hopefully would share with Europeans. Professor Gallay contrasts these two influences in the first English attempts to colonize America in North Carolina and in, Guyana. Did I say that correctly?
Mm-hmm.
Gallay holds the Lyndon B. Johnson Chair of U.S. History at Texas Christian University. He is currently researching Native life on the Pacific Northwest coast and the role of spirituality in people's response to colonialism from the 18th century to the mid-20th century. That's a lot. Thank you so much, Dr. Gallay, for joining us this evening. And again, I've said it many times in our private conversations. Thank you so much for your scholarship and your work. It's absolutely wonderful and very meaningful, especially to Native peoples.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm really happy to be here and glad to talk with you about these issues and history that we have such a love of and are so curious about. You know, it's sort of what keeps us going. Two of us going is delving into this Native past, especially in North Carolina and South Carolina and the surrounding areas. So I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. Well, yes, and it does. It for me, it's what flings the covers back in the mornings, right? Just kind of jump into this, and it really is uncovering history. And I think for a lot of Native peoples, reclaiming history. I think there's such a disconnect to this era of the 16th and the 17th centuries for Native peoples, especially in the Carolinas, as first contact peoples. And as a Lumbee Indian, I grew up with this kind of interesting sort of connection to Fort Raleigh and the theory perhaps that Lumbee people and actually several other tribes in North Carolina are descended from what would become the Lost Colony. I don't think a lot of us, unless you're going up there to visit, call it Fort Raleigh. I think for the most part, everyone refers to it as the Lost Colony. So the mystery around the story itself is really what has kept it so interesting and alive, aside from the fact that it was one of the earliest colonies in the New World. So to get us started, can you give us a sketch of the Fort Raleigh colony? What was it? How did it get started?
Well, for one thing, there were three major expeditions there. And there are actually some expeditions in between. But, you know, what I'd start with is that once Raleigh received a patent from the Queen, which is a grant, which his brother previously had the patent to build the first English colony in America. And he died in the process. And Raleigh asked the Queen if he could have it, and she granted it to him. So he did a lot of planning and thinking about colonization. You know, people used to think that, well, the English never done it before, so they sort of just jumped in without really knowing what they're doing. And that's really not how it went. First of all, Raleigh's older brother had planned for years to colonize. And Raleigh himself, before he went, had gathered around him some of the best minds in England to help him figure out how to do this. And so the first expedition that was sent over was basically just to find, where do we go? Where should we plant ourselves? And where the Europeans haven't planted themselves. Because that was part of his patent, that he couldn't be doing it where Europeans already were living. And that expedition only stayed 6-8 weeks, basically. The second expedition, once they found where to go and how to get there, is another important thing. They'd never sailed to America before. So the first time was just to get the basics down so they could repeat themselves and get back to the same place again. The second expedition lasted much longer. It's closer to a year. And this was sort of their scientific expedition. In many ways, the most famous of the expeditions. It has Thomas Harriot, one of the leading scientists and mathematicians in England. And sending him was sort of like sending Stephen Hawking to the moon. As far as the English were concerned, they had never been to America. You're sending your brightest scientists. So to tell Raleigh, what the heck is there? What can we do with this land there? How can we make some monies so that the colonists, so we can have a colony, and can it be self-sustaining? These were all key questions. And Raleigh, who wanted to go, was denied by the Queen because he was her favorite and she wanted to keep him close to home. So he also sent the painter John White. And White's charge, like Harriet's, was this: tell me about this land and tell me about the people. So Harriet will write up the first book by an Englishman who'd been to America, The Brief and True Report on the Newfound Land of Virginia, because Raleigh winds up naming it Virginia after the Queen's virginity on the second round. And White is painting watercolors of what's North Carolina, even though they call it Virginia. And later, these materials are going to be given by Raleigh to Theodor de Bry, who'll wind up, he's German, winds up in Frankfurt, and he's going to engrave White's paintings. And he'll also publish in a volume Harriet's book and Harriet's captions, which are often overlooked in the history of the colony. Those captions were great at trying to explain native life. So the second expedition had the charge of Raleigh needs to know, who do I next send to colonize? What kind of people do I need to send? And what can they do to make a living there? And so Harriet writes the book that tells him, and really it tells the world, so to speak, this is what's in Virginia. This is what the English are going to do. And he hopes to get investors, people interested in moving there. And it's also, ultimately, it's to show off what England has accomplished so quickly in America. Because everything that England does at this time in the 1580s, in some ways, is a response to what Spain is doing. Spain's the most powerful empire in Europe, both not just with its overseas holdings in much of the Americas, but also in Europe itself. It controls the Netherlands, which is actually in revolt at this time, parts of Italy. It has different places around Europe. So it's the big bad guy to many people in Europe at the time. And it's making a fortune off of America. So, he's planning these different expeditions. And even to, just to give you a little idea of the detail, I found in the British Library, Raleigh created a recipe for barreling beef. How to preserve the meat we're sending with the colonists. And Harriet held classes for the mariners, the particular ones who needed to know, on how to navigate the ship. And he went into detail, but not where going over the top where they wouldn't understand. He just taught them what they needed to know and not how it all worked, just to help them get there and to get back. So there was a lot of planning going on. In fact, at this time, Harriet designs the most technologically advanced ship in all of England, which lasts well into the 17th century, becomes known as Raleigh's bark. Eventually he sells it to Queen Elizabeth, where Harriet goes down to the ports and interviews mariners and what kinds of improvements can he make and so on. So that's what I mean by this being a very carefully prepared enterprise that now needs to send these people over so they can establish at some point a permanent colony. And I left out the third expedition, major expedition, was the one to actually try to colonize what became the Lost Colony. And can I jump back to the first one for a second?
Absolutely, yeah.
So the first one, though, what it accomplishes, and I think they didn't realize it was going to be such an important accomplishment at the time, was the expedition brought home two native peoples. Manteo and Wanchese. And they're important, I think, for two basic reasons. One, it proved to England that Raleigh really had sent a ship to America. Repeatedly, people did not believe that Raleigh sent these ships, that they ever went to America. And even when he went to America, there were always people saying, no, he's making it all up. It was like saying that, how people doubt that the United States landed on the moon. Mm-hmm. There were just so many doubters that there was this world out there with all these native peoples. One of the basic questions in people's minds had been, why did God not tell us about these people? Why aren't they in the Bible? It was very confusing. And we'll see in some of the pictures I show a bit later how some people decided to deal with those issues. But it was confusing, and there were a lot of skeptics or cynics. It's like the Flat Earth Society, and so this way they brought people home, two people, both highly intelligent. Raleigh parades them around. They meet other people in Parliament. They meet people from the highest levels of government, and it gives some legitimacy to what Raleigh's doing and promotes the colony. See, here are the real people. It's not just what I'm telling you about the New World. Here are the people. And so it's very important in Raleigh's life. In fact, throughout his life, he will have Native Americans living with him. Even at the end of his career, towards the end of his career, when he's in prison for many years, he's allowed to have two Native people come visit him every day in prison to help him with his experiments and so on in the Tower of London. And in fact, one of them returns to their home in South America, and Raleigh later visits him in South America. I mean, it's just, you don't think about, here's a new world where they haven't been to, and Raleigh's going to go visit somebody he knows from England who had gone home. So he is helping to make a large world much smaller. And that's what I think Roanoke helps to do. And the engravings that are at your museum gives you this sense, I think, of some of the wonder that some English felt about this new world. And here you can see pictures done by the engraver off of John White's watercolors. And notice there's a front and back picture. It's almost as if in this one, the natives are under like a scientific observation, asking you to take a fuller view, to look around at these people and look behind, and you see they've got bows and arrows here. And so it's to place them in a specifically New World context and to show here are these same people in front, the same fellow, so to speak, and his fellows behind him who are living their lives. They're real people. So they do subtle things in these engravings, as we'll see, to try to get certain points across to Europe at large. And these depictions become so very important. And I'll just throw in right now how important when Thomas Jefferson is in Paris as a diplomat. He makes a purchase of that volume plus the additional many volumes that come to comprise the America series. And he brings them back to the United States, and that begins the Library of Congress. Comes out of this Virginia volume, there's a Florida volume, there's South American volumes. This is the beginning of the Library of Congress. I mean, he knew when he bought them. And that was 1780s. He buys these. So that's almost 200 years, because that Virginia volume was published 1790. Almost 200 years later, he wants to get a copy of these volumes. They're still that important. I mean, how many of us think about books 200 years old? Books usually don't have a shelf life like that. But these engravings that you're showing from that book on Virginia, they have had an incredible shelf life. So I highly recommend it. I'm looking forward to coming myself to see these engravings. I'm coming up in a few weeks to look at your exhibition. So that gets us started.
Yes, I'm well, I'm here. I'm taking all kinds of notes. I'm like trying to keep up with the conversation. There's just so much that I think we, just two places. One is Native peoples, where a lot of our stories have been sort of locked away, even erased. And so bringing these details back in a way that makes sense. I mean, understanding kind of the politics and the interest, especially of Sir Walter Raleigh, really helps give context and understanding to that history. But also, I think just as Americans, we don't have a very strong understanding of our early history, right? For most of America, the history starts with American Revolution, and we jump to the Civil War, and it's kind of anchored in wars without these details of how things played out. You talked a little bit about how Raleigh was a very savvy businessman, just looking at the opportunities in terms of starting a colony or funding a colony. Can you share a little bit more about what was in it for Raleigh in pursuing a colony here? What were the business advantages? What were some of the materials or peoples or things that could come out of the New World that would benefit him in his own business ventures?
One of the things that almost all colonizers wanted, but Raleigh recognized was not going to be here in America, but he'll look for elsewhere, is people wanted to get rich. And that meant they wanted to find precious metals, gold and silver. And pretty quickly, they recognized that they weren't going to find easily gold and silver like had been discovered with the Aztec Empire. And of course, with Peru, with the silver, and later Mexico with silver as well. So when Raleigh sends Harriet over, it's like, Thomas, can you tell me what is there in America that we can use that I can make some money off of? Well, actually, he's not saying so much it's really so the colony survives. Later, when he goes to Guyana, I think it's more of because they're hoping there to find gold. He's going there specifically for gold. He also is going to colonize simultaneously that he's in America. He's developing a colony in Ireland for the Queen. And so he has lands there. And there he's engaging in a bunch of economic enterprises that revolve around lumber production. And he's going to be experimenting with iron, glass. Now, of course, Ireland's much closer to England, and he sees those things can work well to be produced in Ireland and to supply England, but he winds up sending, he has the wood turned into cask for wine. I mean, huge casks that could hold like 100 gallons of wine. And he sends them to the wine islands in the Atlantic to pick up wine and bring it to England. So now to contextualize what's he doing in America, the hope was for silk. And their logic was, the land of North Carolina, although they didn't call it that, that land would probably be perfect for producing silk. Silk at the time in the 16th century was considered the world's most valuable human-produced item. And it was key to world trade. And it's coming mostly out of China and Persia. And I don't have time to go into world trade, but it's really the foundation for world trade is Chinese silk. And so he thinks, why don't we do that in America? And he's not the only one who's going to do this. He's just the first of the English to do this. Many of the colonies are going to try silk. For instance, Georgia, 100 years later, is going to try, actually 150 years later, will try silk. It turns out that tobacco is going to be the answer, not silk. And tobacco, Raleigh plays the leading role in promoting, by the way, in England. But he's not going to realize that success. That comes in, 50 years later up at Jamestown in Virginia, and then comes back down to North Carolina. But he's looking for like 20, even more items that his colonists can make money at. So I'm not sure so much that it's personal business with him, the Virginia colony. It never got far enough, because of the lost colony, for him to make any money from it. And the interesting thing is, I think, that what kept sidetracking colonization in North Carolina was his ship captains kept going off to capture Spanish ships that had valuable cargo from the Caribbean, South America, and so on. Every time the English would drop off supplies for the colonists or bring more colonists, they'd immediately go privateering, which was just piracy.
Mm-hmm.
And they made so much money capturing Spanish ships at this time that it was hard to get people to invest in colonization. Colonization is a long-term investment. Whereas capturing a ship, it's dangerous, but it's overnight. So it's hard to convince the English not to become a nation of pirates, which is how the Spanish, for instance, looked at them, as a nation of pirates. And Raleigh was interested, as anybody was, in making money that way. And in fact, one of his ships, it didn't go to Roanoke, but it was another one of his ships, made the largest capture, in some ways, people have said, in all human history. It was like a 10-story Portuguese ship, La Madre de Dios, the Mother of God. And it was enough, basically, to fund the English government if they wanted to use everything towards it for 10 years.
Wow.
It was a 10-story ship. It was just filled with billions of dollars in modern terms worth of goods. So it's not that Raleigh was opposed to piracy, but he did see it interfered with colonization. And he's one of the few saying, no, colonization's our future. Colonization's our future. And why is he saying this? Because he and others thought at this time that England didn't have enough land, that they were in a mini ice age. They would refer to England, their home, as that frozen island. And they needed a place to send their surplus population. And that's exactly what America's going to become for them. And Raleigh outlined this to, give me your tired, you're poor. We're going to send poor people to America. And so he really did believe in the colonization, even at the same time that he wants to make money. And I would add in, it was very utopian to him. It was going to help England, but it was also going to help the native peoples. Go ahead if you want to jump in.
I was just going to say, I think that's a great segue. And I think that's maybe where you were going to talk about the Hermeticism, just the ideas that they had. And in terms of, a lot of the work that, whether I'm here at this museum or whether I was at the Smithsonian or in Santa Fe or in Oklahoma, humanizing Native peoples sometimes is a difficult construct for some audiences and visitors. But it sounds like from your book that this idea of Hermeticism helped humanize these people, and maybe even as we look at colonialism, as we construct kind of this concept of conquer, this kind of exceeds that. Can you tell us more about this philosophy that they had? And it sounds like it might have even gotten in the way, perhaps, or maybe I'm misreading, in terms of efforts of colonization. Definitely different than the crown and the queen had anticipated the efforts would go.
Well, ultimately, he tries to convince the queen in a paper he wrote them for her and her advisors that she should build an empire without conquest, and tries to convince her that conquest is not the way to go, and that the native peoples should be considered allies and friends. When he's at Roanoke, he's not interested in conquest, but he hasn't theorized, as far as I know yet, the whole idea of an empire without conquest. He's sort of working towards it. And what he's intended is he envisions a colony where the natives and the English are going to be living together. That's one of the most fascinating things I found, that historians haven't really focused on, is his envisioning this. We're all going to be together. And he doesn't define exactly how it's going to work, but he's not thinking of segregation. He's not thinking of moving the natives out. As several times in his career, he'll proclaim, this land is the natives. It belongs to them. We have no doubt about that. And so he does assert that. One of his assistants will even write a poem about the empire without conquest. I mean, so it's not just him. The idea is floating around, and I think it goes back to Hermeticism. And Hermeticism was a religious philosophy at the time. It was popular among intellectuals, especially scientists, people involved in medicine and healing, the people who we would call today physicists and chemists. Some scholars note that modern chemistry comes out of the alchemy that's part of Hermeticism. And Raleigh himself is an alchemist. He has a laboratory for years, and he does look at precious metals, but mostly what he's doing is creating medicines to heal people. In fact, his medicines are going to be used to the early 20th century. It's really remarkable how famous he becomes in his own time for the medicines he creates. In fact, he becomes a famous scientist. Historians never talk about that. Francis Bacon, the father of experiential philosophy, and it was, a kind of approach to science based upon reason and experiments, cited Raleigh as one of the three great scientists of his time. And all three of those scientists were Hermeticists. And one of them was Thomas Harriot, who goes to North Carolina, Raleigh, and the Wizard Earl, who winds up in prison with Raleigh at the same time later on, the Earl of Northumberland, who Pocahontas went to visit at the Tower of London when she gets to England. So all three of them were really interested in native peoples. They're Hermeticists. And the philosophy, I won't go into it too much, but it's a Christian, although actually there's Jewish Hermeticists too. It's a philosophy that emphasizes the unseen universe, things you can't see, which were very attractive to scientists. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Gravity. It forces things to fall to the ground. You can't see it. But Galileo's interested in trying to figure out what this is. Just like another Hermeticist later on, Sir Isaac Newton. With Harriot, it was the atom. He's not the first to theorize about the atom, but you can't see atoms. But what they're interested in is the physical properties, the properties of all things. And the Hermeticists believe that God created all things, and you can't know God, but if you know why he's made things, then you come closer to understanding God's purpose for humanity. And so they saw this as a holy thing to do, to study science, to study the nature of things. And so how do native peoples fit into this? Their answer for, well, why did God hide these people and reveal them now was, it's because God's blessed them. It's obvious that God's blessed them. They live in Eden. They live in paradise. they've been given this rich, incredibly rich, these continents that have so much food. And when they saw the native peoples of North Carolina and Virginia, they saw that they were much larger than them. They were more physically fit, more physical. This is before disease had rampaged through, the diseases that were carried to Europe, to America. And so they thought, wow. First of all, if you read Raleigh's History of the World, you hear his ideas that, God gave land to each group of people. That's one thing that he talks about right from the beginning. And then he teaches them how to use that land. So even without Christ, the natives had been blessed. And at this time, the discovery of America was connected by many people in Europe with the impending end of the world, the second coming of Jesus. So there was this religious undercurrent to America itself, that there was virtue in going to explore and discover. But with Raleigh, there was this, and others, there's this idea that the native peoples themselves are blessed. We should go and learn from them. They'll share with us their knowledge. They're obviously ingenious, as we'll see in some of the pictures I'll show you in a bit. So that Hermeticism opened up Raleigh and others to, shall we say, embracing. And that's why I think these pictures illustrate the Hermeticism of Raleigh and White and Harriet. That, and that it's a particular kind of view of people and what the Europeans should be looking for from them. And this is, leads him then later on to argue with Queen Elizabeth that, this is fascinating too. He says, we shouldn't even send missionaries over there. He goes, somebody sends a missionary to your country and tries to change you from your religion, you have the right to kill that person. I mean, you can't just go in and try to change people. And he says basically, we don't need to change their culture. He argues ultimately for alliances, where the English should teach the native peoples how to make modern weaponry so they can defend themselves against the Spanish. The Spanish, who have already gone through so much of South America and conquered in Mexico and so on, help the natives withstand the Spanish, just like the English are trying to withstand the Spanish. It's at this time, people wonder why Raleigh didn't come back to save the colony that becomes lost, because Spain had invaded England. At the time, Elizabeth said, no ships go anywhere. They all have to stay here to defend the country. Now, he probably could have gotten some ships there shortly thereafter. It took a while for him to do that. But the point is, England identified with these native peoples. They and us, he was thinking, all of us fear conquest by the Spanish. And how far did he go in these ideas? He even said, one day they may ask us for missionaries. That's when we should send them, only if they ask us. And if some of the men convert, then Elizabeth should send females, English females, to marry native men. And that would then bring the cultures closer together diplomatically. But he's not arguing for taking over these native societies and changing them. In fact, he says, with an alliance that's made, Elizabeth should send one person to advise them in diplomatic matters. But otherwise, they're not trying to change the native peoples. I mean, there's more to it than I'm passing out right now because just of time element. But it's just a fascinating idea of alliance rather than conquest. And he's so tolerant and open-minded. He even, explains this in his book, History of the World, that even although he's a very good, pious Christian, but he said, you don't have to be Christian to be pious. And he talks about the history of mankind and says a lot of these people weren't Christian. God loved them just as well. So he's incredibly tolerant, which is ironic because he's often portrayed as a radical Protestant when he's not. In fact, probably most of his friends seem to be Catholic rather than Protestant. But, people overlook these things that he's, and their Hermeticists, by the way, are popular with Catholics and Protestants. It goes beyond denominational differences that are really divisive in Europe at this time. So he's really speaking a language of tolerance, and not just of tolerance, but acceptance, I should say, that people's cultures, should be embraced. That, he even goes so far as to state to his fellow English, we're not the chosen people. Where in the Bible does it say the English are the chosen people? It's not there. So he's thinking a lot about native peoples. That's why he writes a history of the world, I think, later. Is he's not talking a lot specifically about native peoples in that book, but his thinking about colonialism and about what it means to be living in a certain place and having that land and maybe moving to other places. He's thinking about colonization. He writes a whole book about it. So, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I think that's so interesting to think, really the point of this conversation is the very things you're talking about, is all of these ideas and philosophies and intentions and goals for this place, right? So you have Raleigh and others who are part of the colony, white, with these thoughts and ideas about what should become of this land and these peoples. And then you have the native peoples who are on the other side of this, right? And we all know how the outcome of history, but it's interesting to put a pin in this moment of what is this 1586, 1587, to see here is this European power that ultimately will have one of the greatest roles in colonizing not only native peoples in North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, the Southeast, but really throughout
the globe.
Yeah, the globe, and what would become America, specifically for indigenous peoples, to think that they're wrestling with these ideas of what to do and how to go about things. And then you have native peoples who are also trying to understand what are they thinking, and then what are, I think this positions the next question is looking at what was the native response to this? What were the politics between the two? And, how were they what was the tension between both? Because native peoples also saw advantages for the colonists to be there, and they had their own ideas. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, the I hate to just qualify it as politics, but maybe the dynamics or the intersectionality, the intersections of worlds, to plug our exhibit again, of these peoples coming together? Because it wasn't just one-sided of the English wrestling with what to do. Native peoples were also thinking the same. And I think that Cochise and Manteo and others provide insight to their thoughts about the colony.
Yeah, I mean, they're great examples, because the two of them, and I'll pronounce them just my way, is Manteo and Wanchese, because I don't know how the towns are pronounced, but the names, at least, we don't really know. But anyway, Manteo and Wanchese go to England. They talk with Harriet. They learn English. Harriet takes down a lot of the language. Manteo comes back. He's in love with England. He had a great time there. And he dresses like an Englishman. And he becomes the colony's best friend. The colony doesn't survive as long as it does without Manteo, because he's the one that mediates for them and has the language skills so that Harriet can collect all this information that he brings back to Raleigh. When Chasey, as soon as he gets off the ship back in North America, he doesn't ever want to see the English again. He hates them. He hates what he's seen in England. And we don't know the details of it, but we know he's utterly disgusted with that society. So those are two extremes. In this case, it's a for and against. And I think for most people, though, there's more gray areas than existed perhaps for those two. And those gray areas are created by trade goods, for one thing. The initiative of both the natives and the English wanting to trade with one another, of wanting to learn from one another. I'll give you a good example of something they share. The English, the second most important thing that the English want to get out of America for the next 200 years, one thing is the products of the land. The second thing is to learn about how to treat health. If you go to the British Library and you look at the correspondence coming from America to Europe and back and forth for the next couple hundred years, to the American Revolution, the biggest thing Europeans are interested in is, could you tell us about how the natives treat health? What are the plants they use to treat disease? How do they treat, different kinds of illnesses? So health was just huge. You can't overestimate how important the collection on health was. Well, when the peoples in North Carolina get sick, as Harriet noted, they're catching these diseases. He doesn't realize it's the Europeans that brought these diseases over. He does note they're coming to us now for help. These are new diseases. Can we help them, cure? So health is important to both groups of people. And, they also could see that as spiritual. If our medicine is not helping us withstand these European diseases, and this is common in early American history, not just here, but other parts of the Americas, that's when you're more likely to get people to convert to Christianity. If they see the Europeans are not fallen from these diseases, and they think, well, maybe I need this Christian medicine. Maybe that's what I need to survive. And if you look at the missions, the Spanish missions, often the native peoples who go there are those who are unhealthy and they need help. They need help. The strong don't go to missions, or if they do, they refuse to convert. Like the Yamasee in Florida just don't convert to Christianity. They're using the missions for other purposes. And they kind of come in and out. Those who need help are the ones who are likely to convert. So, you could say the same thing about the Europeans too. We forget how many thousands of Europeans run away to go live with the Indians, that they find their life. We call them the white Indians. They find their lifestyle preferable to their own, the social bonds that are created among people and so on. So that's what I mean by the gray. There, few people seem to be like Wanchese, and Monteo. They're sort of at extremes. And most people are kind of like, I do kind of like that silk they're bringing in, or that clock the Europeans are bringing in, but I don't like A, B, and C. Mm-hmm. So, and and I think the Europeans are the same way. That even if they proclaim, I don't like those natives, they wind up adopting a lot of what the natives do and think. It's fascinating stuff how much they adopt from native peoples. And by the way, with those medicines I was talking about, I forget how many hundreds, but I think it's over 300 items from native plants used in cures. It was later adopted into the pharmacopoeia of the United States, especially in the 19th century.
And think about food. How much food? You give me, we talked about the potato, Raleigh introducing the potato to Ireland, which then becomes the Irish potato.
Yeah, the North Carolina potato.
Blew my mind.
Harriet brings it back and it catches on. And we think of it with the famine, but it becomes the staple of life. That's why the famine was so powerful, because so many Irish, it was the staple that they ate. So,
well, I think as we're talking about these people and these ideas, let's look at some of the images, because I think they help to unpack a lot of the views and even some of the agendas and propaganda even that are included in introducing native peoples to different parts of Europe.
I love this one. This is Adam and Eve. Opens up the Virginia volume, you know. So the other pictures are of native peoples, but they put in this one of Adam and Eve. And one of the questions that the Hermeticists were raising were, well, then was there a second Adam? Since they're not in the Bible, is coming from Adam? Could there have been a second Adam? And you can see in the back and smaller, you can see some native people are tilling the land and so on, with Adam being there. Now, it's also to represent that America is like a paradise. It is, another Garden of Eden. But it's something that Barlow, who's on the first expedition, was one of the leaders of the first expedition, will basically put forth this idea that was popular among many Hermeticists, that there was a second Adam that God just didn't tell people about. That is going to raise some hackles. And so if we look at the second picture, now this actually fronts the Florida volume, which came out afterwards. And it's sort of meant to now explain, no, there's not a second Adam. And look, there's no native peoples in here, but this is how they open up the second volume on natives in Florida. And it's Adam. And if you can see it, Adam gets off the ark. The animals are coming off 2 by 2. And this is to show that, for one thing, that the natives were born of one of Adam's sons or grandsons, so that they are part of the Bible. And secondly, this is one of the most typical Hermeticist pictures there is. And if you notice, and we're going to see this again, look at this massive fire that Noah's creating to put up it's a sacrifice to God. So the fire comes up, and then look at that billowing smoke. And the key in Hermeticism is fire. Fire is what is used in alchemy, and it's used to turn things from a substance into something else. It's ignition system. And one of the things it creates is this billowing smoke. And then look what's right above the smoke. Those are Hebrew letters that symbolize Yahweh, the unpronounceable name of God. So even though de Bry, by the way, who's the leading Hermeticist publisher in Europe, he and his family, for several generations is giving this Hermeticist, even though we're not saying they're Adam anymore, okay, so they are from Noah, but he's also saying to the rest of Europe, this is them, they're blessed. That's what this fire and smoke does, and that's why this picture's here. It's a way to tell people in Europe and to other Hermeticists, these pictures you're going to see now, these are of blessed people. So let's go to this one that you see here. And this is to show the ingenuity of the native peoples. And again, look at the fire and the smoke. And it's right there in the middle of the canoe. It's to burn out the canoe. So even though they don't have iron tools, that they have found this extremely creative way to create their famous piraguas that can hold so many people and are the basic mode of transportation on waterways. It's used throughout the Southeast. Often these are huge cedar trees and so on. And then you see the use of the canoe, the piragua. Notice there's a fire in the middle of the canoe. Now, this is again, another Hermeticist thing, and this is actually used here, just like it was used in Ireland, but the English didn't do this, was to do night fishing, where you create a fire within a canoe to attract the fish. And then you can spear them, and you can see the people in the background are spearing, but also note the ingenuity on the left side of the engraving. You can see the weirs that were built. And this was a basic way for the North Carolina natives to capture fish. And in fact, at least 3 times, Ralph Lane refers to the English are starving because they can't fix the weirs the natives created and that broke down. They need the natives to fix the weirs for them and to build new ones to capture fish. They just don't have the skills to do this. And that's what makes Lane irate and is going to lead him into violence against Wingina's people right off of Roanoke Island. So this ingenuity, we can see it right here in the third one as well. You won't be able to read on the left because of the size. Don't worry about it. But that was written by Harriet. These are the captions I was talking about. And there are letters you can see on the pictures. And thus you can go from the letter to the picture, and he explains what's going on here. This happens to be the French version. This picture's from. But notice on the right, if you see where the H, the G, and the F are, those are 3 different fields to show that the natives have 3 different crops of maize per year. Look how neat the fields are depicted. And you can also see this is a hodgepodge, a pastiche of other pictures that White made. You can see in the left, there's a fire, and there's other fires in the picture. The fire was so important to their Hermeticists that every time Harriet sees a fire, he defines that fire. This is a different kind of fire than this fire. This is for this purpose. So fire is so important. And by the way, why is it so important? Because to the Hermeticists, the most important event in the Bible, at least in the Old Testament, is when Moses sees the burning bush. Because this is the only time, basically, the human sees God. God allows human to see them. So it symbolizes what people should hope for, that one day they can come close to God like Moses did. So that's the Hermeticist symbol of, why fire is so important. It's not just the alchemical aspect, the chemical, that it can change things and make things better, but that it symbolizes the connection between God and man. So here we see another one as we move through these. This is Pomiak, so we could see how natives live. He shows other villages. We're not going to look at those pictures. But you can see, an attempt to show how the buildings are constructed, how they're opened up on sides during the hot seasons, again, with fire in the middle. And let's go to another one. This is a colorized version. Many people who bought the books colorized the pictures. And let's go. This is one of my favorites right here. It's very important. It's probably a green corn ceremony. And what White is trying to do here, notice each native person's step is different in the dance. He's trying to show you a native dance, what the steps are. And he does it in this, this circular way here. So you can get, how do you give a sense of movement? This is as close as he can to giving Raleigh a sense of what the dances would look like. It's just, an amazingly well thought out picture. Okay, let's go to the next one. I love this one, the broiling of fish, because again, you see the fire and smoke. Now, this fire is so huge, it would incinerate those fish. But again, it's Hermeticist. They're trying to emphasize the importance of fire and smoke in native life. And again, that these are godly things that they're doing. And we see it again. Look at the next one. And there, this pot should fall over, right? I mean, look at it. It's pointed at the bottom. It should just fall over the way it's held up. And all that smoke coming out of it. It's what they would call back then a loblolly, a stew. And again, this is sending out a message to the intellectuals in Europe. Yep, these Indians are blessed. This just ain't any old fire. And now we see pictures. This is one of the most fascinating things I think about the John White's paintings and the engravings of them, is he shows natives in their daily life and also at different ages. So here we see the infant and how the mother carries the infant. He's very interested in showing how Indians walk, sit, stroll, and so on, and including how they carry their children. And the engraver always throws in these backgrounds to specifically place them in North Carolina here, whereas the painter didn't do that. He focused on just the people. It's one of the interventions the engraver does is he combines backgrounds with people. So if we go to the next one, now here's an aged man. So someone who's of an older age and very distinguished looking. And you see him on top of the village here. Okay. And I think, is that the last one? Yeah. So why don't we have time for some questions before we go? That's a great question. Why did Raleigh's philosophy fail? Greed, religious zealots? The philosophy itself survived well into the 17th century. Actually, they're Hermeticists today. But the philosophy of the religious aspects, but for reasons I can't really explain, by the late 1590s, even the middle 1590s, many people were unwilling to see the natives as being blessed. This was an important moment in time, but there was so much hostility to seeing natives as being blessed. And instead, we get natives painted as savages. And you look at the later volumes, especially from volume 3 on, that the de Bry published, the natives are going to be portrayed as barbaric, as interested in desecrating European bodies, in battle, and things like that. And not even just scalping, but taking off all kinds of trophies from body parts. And it's not completely making them diabolical, but there is now a sense that the natives are influenced by the devil. And the Spanish had already done this in a sense. They divided the native peoples into two. There were those, the Indios, who could be converted and become Christian. They could be, quote unquote, civilized. And then there were the cannibals, those who will want to eat you and that were beyond redemption. And I think as we move forward in time, the English and the Dutch in particular, who had been opposed to the Spanish and thus opposed to their depiction of native peoples in general, began buying into this idea of the savage rather than these are people blessed by God. I mean, you always did wind up with some people believing this. We call this, it evolves into the noble Indian. The idea that natives are the only ones who still have purity or can have purity. And by their connection to the land and to the spiritual world and through their rituals. So the noble Indian remains, just like the commercial with the tear coming down, right? But the idea that they're specially blessed is going to be set aside. That is too much for a lot of Christians to accept, that people without Christianity, can be specially blessed by God. So that's going to die away too.
Wow.
But Raleigh himself, I do want to add in, remains very popular in the 17th century. His ideas among scientists, if we had time, we could go into it, and among people who are interested in tolerance. He is a best-selling author of the 17th century. His History of the World goes through so many editions. And his Discovery of Guyana, his book about, the search for El Dorado, remains popular into the 20th century. So he does have a lot of influence, but it's not the majority influence, certainly.
I think Guyana threw me off earlier just because you think about how could, such vastly different, distant places for him to have interest in so many different areas. And it's just, it's just fascinating. I mean, he was such a dynamic person. And, his interest influenced, especially through the colony, so many different lives of people, not just through industry or opportunity, but just the impacts, the human toll that his interest had. Are there any more questions? Do we have any more questions? I don't want to be respectful of time. I might have one more final question that is one that we address a lot here in the museum. It's just theory. Are there any more questions from the audience? Oh, there we go. So we have a quick answer to that. The museum is actually working with Dr. Gallay to create at least for North Carolina, but it could be used widely, a curriculum specifically focusing on the Indian slave trade, but we can certainly employ this and continue these conversations. And this conversation itself is recorded and becomes a product that we could use for teachers and share online just to share this information, as well as the book, which is very approachable. And that's one of the things that I appreciate about your writing is it is so comprehensive. I think a lot of times historians write these texts that are just so cerebral, it's hard to grasp a lot of the concepts, but I think this is just a book that is approachable for anyone. So thank you for that. Yes.
I spent a good year trying to work on writing these complex issues to make them more manageable, so people could learn from them and enjoy them. So I appreciate, that you picked up on that.
Yes, absolutely. This and the Indian slave trade, which is another very complex history. Well, for the sake of time, we have about 2 minutes left. What are your thoughts about what happened to the colony? I think that's just kind of a question that everybody wants to know. We've learned a lot about Raleigh and the politics. It was so short-lived. What are your thoughts?
Can I skirt it for a bit by asking what happened to the other lost colony?
Yeah.
The one that doesn't get talked about?
Mm-hmm.
There was another lost colony or colonist of sorts that never gets talked about. That second expedition went home when a hurricane hit North Carolina. They were going to go up to Chesapeake, and at the last second, Francis Drake was going to carry everybody up there, but because of the hurricane, he decides to leave, and people hop on the boat and go back home. Well, Drake had brought 100 people who he had liberated from slavery, both natives and Africans, in the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean, and he brought them to be free colonists at Roanoke. And we don't know what happened to them. I do talk about it in the book, but my theory is because one of the ships had been sent up to the Chesapeake, and I can't find what happened to these people anywhere, and I think they were on that ship, and I think they got off probably around the Dismal Swamp and settled there. So there's a lost colony. It doesn't get talked about. I'm not the first one that's discovered this by any means, but they don't get talked about, certainly in the classroom and otherwise. I think because they're not white. It's not Virginia Dare. It's not a white child being born here. And that's the first lost colony, Virginia Dare. That's in 86, right with the second colony with Harriet. And but as far as what happened with the colony, the other lost colony, I really don't know. There's so many people have looked at this. I think it is likely that these people survived till about 1606. And, that the reports that the Virginians the English at Virginia up in Jamestown heard was that the survivors had been put to death a year before they went to Virginia. So that would have been 1606.
Oh, wow.
But that they were living with native peoples up towards the Chesapeake. That they had actually migrated up there, like they were supposed to, where they were supposed to be. So, whoops, my light went off.
Yeah. We have that here too at UNCP. I mean, we could just continue talking. I know we have an hour program, but this is just absolutely fascinating history. It, again, is just, we've discussed, just scratch the surface in terms of how all of this plays out, who Walter Raleigh was and some of the other people and just their ideas, how that informed the experience. Mm-hmm. This is absolutely wonderful. I'm going to finish reading the book and probably have lots more questions. I feel like we should do a part 2 of this program just to keep going. I do want to say we're having a program here at the museum on April the 29th that we're calling Art Night Out, which is an evening of hands-on activities, creating art, looking at the exhibition, but also exploring some of the themes. Dr. Goulet will be with us, and he will do a gallery walk. So we'll have the benefit of having him in person and the original engravings to kind of further explore this history. We'll post more information on our Facebook page and our website in the next day or so. We invite everyone to come out. But tonight was absolutely wonderful. I agree. It is fascinating. Someone just posted. Thank you so much again for your scholarship. I each time I'm left speechless, and I have so many more questions that I would like to formulate, but your work is just invaluable. And as I mentioned at the start of the show, what you are uncovering and have the benefit of understanding the history and unpacking it for us is just absolutely invaluable. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I'm so glad to share this with you and talk about these things with you. And I look forward to doing it again in the future and seeing you soon at the end of the month.
Perfect.
Up in North Carolina. And thanks for everybody for coming and sharing this with me. That's what I love to do, is I study these things and then get to share it with people. So that's my reward.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we look forward to spending more time with Dr. Gallay in the future. Thank you. Yes. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.